Thanks very much. I'd just like to begin today by thanking Emma Gooch and Jerome Ruddock for organising this conference and for all the other panelists today for their thought-provoking and insightful papers. And today I will be tackling the topic of the materiality of ancient Greek identity through a close reading of a corpus of piglet-bearing figurines found at the Temple of Demeter and Kore in Corinth. The figurines, which date to the classical and Hellenistic periods, will be used to provide an insight into the strategies employed by Corinthian women to construct their gender identity and experience of womanhood, in particular as defined by the periods of bleeding which made up the life course of a woman in the ancient world. To do this, I'm going to start by unpacking what it meant to be a woman in the ancient world, bound to bleed, as Helen King memorably puts it. We'll then examine how this bleeding was used to construct female identity, particularly at significant points of transition, such as the move between Parthenos, maiden, and Gyne, woman or wife. We shall then compare this to the understanding of the life course of a woman with the life course of a pig, to understand the role of piglet sacrifice in a ritual context. Finally, I aim to show how this evidence comes together at the sanctuary in Corinth and how these statuettes exemplify a self-conscious desire to actively shape one's identity through ritual and votive offerings, and how these statuettes' very materiality is crucial to understanding the role that they play in generating the social identity of the women who dedicated them. So, let us begin. Womanhood in the ancient world was a fundamentally different experience than it is now. In some ways, this goes without saying, but it's important to preface my work with this as it underscores what I'm attempting to do today. With the gaps in our evidence, the relevant absence of women's voices talking about themselves and their experiences, it sometimes seems impossible to even begin to discover what it was like to be a woman in the ancient world, let alone to see the ways in which these women took an active role in structuring their identities. However, through the objects I'll be talking about today, I hope to show that it is possible to access, in a limited way, things which are not contained in the literary record. Womanhood was understood as a biological reality as well as a social one in the ancient world. And while there are certain experiences which we may feel have a timeless element to them, for instance, menstruation, the fact of the matter is different cultures in different times have understood and explained issues surrounding gynecology very, very differently. For instance, for the ancient Greek medical writers, menstruation was understood as the outcome of women's fundamentally different biology. Firstly, all fluid was conceptualized as blood, from menstrual blood to semen to breast milk, and this could move around the body to produce different states. And in a mature woman, menstrual blood was how her spongy, moist body expelled excessive nutrients that their weaker bodies did not use up. A growing child would use those nutrients in their growth, but once mature, the fluid would build up, potentially pooling in other parts of the body and causing madness. If the menstrual flow did not begin at the proper time, it was thought to become very dangerous and, if prolonged, would prove fatal. We can see then how menstruation becomes part of how one is constructed as a healthy person, a crucial indicator of the various internal mechanisms that are going on. However, menstruation was not important only in terms of health, but also social function. The onset of menstruation signaled that a girl was ready for marriage, that transition, as we mentioned before, from Parthenos to Gyne. And menarche was just the first of a series of bleedings in the life course of a woman. From the rather genderless body of a child, menarche was seen as the climax of maturity, signaling that someone was ready to in turn bear children. Once a woman became pregnant, the blood, which had previously been evacuated through the vagina, went to feeding the growing fetus. Birth itself was a bloody affair, and post-birth, lochial bleeding was as important to the process as parturition itself, something we see reflected on various tombs and inscriptions from a funerary context. After birth, blood was still required to provide nutrition, but instead of going directly to the fetus, it migrated to a woman's breasts and was produced as breast milk, as evidenced by the fact that lactation suppressed menstruation. Then, after around a year, the baby was weaned and menstruation began again, and the cycle could continue. And continue it must. Research has shown that for the population of classical Athens to remain at reproduction rate, each woman would need to give birth 5 or 6 times over the course of her life, with menstruation occurring only in the periods in between. From all of this, we can start to see the significant role that menstruation played, along with other periods of bleeding, in the lives of women, not as a monthly occurrence, but a rare event, which could prove to be something of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it was necessary for a woman to be able to menstruate. It meant she was healthy and capable of fulfilling her socially designated role in producing children. On the other hand, any actual instance of menstruation was evidence that a woman was not, at that particular moment, with child. We can therefore see how menstruation became a focus of concern and something over which a woman may have desire to exercise control. The Hippocratic authors make various suggestions for inducing menstruation. For Parthenoi, they prescribe a swift marriage as a course of treatment, as the heat of intercourse would loosen the neck of a closed womb, which was conceptualized as being something like an upside-down jar. And physical blockages would prevent the passage of the menses. However, they do also indicate other ways of dealing with the issue of amenorrhea. They speak of women, as in here, who dedicate many different things to Artemis at the abatement of the madness of unfulfilled menstruation. They dismiss this as a deception on the part of religious figures, but it does point to an intriguing set of alternative practices relating to issues surrounding menstruation. Artemis here was likely acting in her role as protector of youths, but she's far from the only goddess who presides over such matters. It's conceivable that at different locations, different deities may have been approached to deal with such matters. And it's with this that I'd like to turn to look at the case study of the temple of Demeter and Kore in Corinth. Kore, also known as Persephone, has long been understood as the paradigmatic Greek bride, something explored by Sherry and Daphne in their talk earlier. Her kidnapping and marriage to Hades parallels the traditions of the Greek wedding, and her mother, Demeter, too, also seems to deal with difficult transitions, mourning her daughter's displacement from the natal home to the marital one, the original empty nester, perhaps. But I argue that these aspects come to the fore of the sanctuary of Demeter and Kore in Corinth. But to explain why, we must take a further look at the piglet-bearing figurines themselves. This is just a small selection of many of the hundreds of figurines that were found here. But it goes to, I must say first, that piglet-bearing statuettes are not exclusive to Corinth, as Michael Siaginetti has shown with his seminal study of statuettes of this type of the sanctuaries of Demeter in Sicily. However, these types are slightly different, but I think it's important to note this because piglets are strongly associated with the worship of Demeter in general, not just here. It's reported that at the Attic Thesmophoria, a women's only harvest festival in honor of Demeter, which was one of the most widely celebrated festivals in the Greek world, piglets would be thrown into a pit and their decomposed remains dug out by the initiates to be taken home as a kind of party bag of holy fertilizer at the festival's end. Moreover, while the blood of a piglet was used to purify the temple of Apollo at Delphi, blood was also used to cleanse the hands of murderers. But despite this, piglets have always had a kind of special relationship with women in a ritual context. As Susan G. Cole has shown, 2 sacred laws from 2 sanctuaries, one of Hercules and one of Demeter, neatly sum up this association. At the sanctuary of Hercules, both women and pigs are banned from the site, while at the sanctuary of Demeter, pigs are required while men are banned. Cole claims that the comparison between these 2 texts suggests a ritual antithesis between Hercules and Demeter. Demeter's space and Demeter's ritual contain what Hercules' space and ritual exclude. While Cole uses this to explore how male and female are separated in ritual categories, it's also clear that the pig itself is a part of how this gender segregation is created. This becomes especially interesting when one considers the usage of piglets in other rituals. At the Thesmophoria, where the body of the pig is used, is something of an outlier. The previous example, mentioning the cleansing of the temple of Apollo and the purification of murderers, instead require the piglet blood alone. And looking at the archaeology of the temple in Corinth, it seems to be set up far more for blood usage than for the usage of the body. While no pit suitable for Attic-style thesmophoric ritual has been found, there are a significant number of remains of piglets at the site, but treated in a very different way. In pit A, seen on screen here, was discovered a large quantity of ash and the bones of many piglets. Within this, there was also a tiny terracotta piglet, shown here on the left, which shows evidence of fire damage, seeming to indicate it had been burnt alongside the Holocaust sacrifice of flesh and blood piglets. In contrast to the demands of everyday life, where pigs were kept and slaughtered for the meat which they provide, it seems at this sanctuary, piglets were valued for their blood more than their bodies, which were simply disposed of after their purpose was fulfilled. And the importance of piglet blood ties back in an interesting way to the connection between piglets and women. Outside of a ritual context, the word koiros, or piglet, did not necessarily refer to a piglet itself, but rather was a common slang term for female genitalia, rather like our modern slang term pussy. As Henderson puts it, this may be due to an alleged physical resemblance between the young pig and the hairless or carefully cropped genitalia of a young girl and depilated woman. I leave it up to you whether or not you think that is a useful analogy. However, as Mark Golden notes, the use of animals as a means of communication by, to, and about human beings is rarely so straightforward as just, do they look the same? And I hope to kind of demonstrate why this is important. If piglets in a ritual context are valued for their blood, they need to bleed. And this bleeding piglet may make us think of a bleeding piglet. That is, the blood-sodden vagina of a menstruating woman. And just like a piglet, a woman's piglet is bound to bleed. Additionally, women's menstrual blood is frequently likened to the blood of a sacrificial animal throughout the Hippocratic corpus. This metaphor, an example of which is quoted on screen, is common across the entire Hippocratic corpus, but it's not used of just any instance of bloodletting. And as King has observed, it is exclusively used of menstrual blood. King argues that the sacrificial analogy provides further evidence of the extent to which ancient gynecology in general carries cultural values, and that this is directly comparable to those expressed in myth, poetry, and the thing I'm really interested in, ritual. The confluence of these factors leads me to suggest that part of ritual life at the Temple of Demeter and Kore in Corinth was focused on the regulation of menstruation through the use of piglet blood and sacrifice. While there is no explicit evidence of this, a preoccupation with menstruation and its role in fertility is expressed in a Roman-era curse tablet found at the site. Now, it's always difficult to use any later evidence to account for earlier cultural practices, a problem compounded at Corinth due to the sack of the city by Mummius in 146. But I believe that this evidence illustrates that menstruation was a concern which people brought to this sanctuary specifically. Deposited in the foundations of a building, the tablets feature an unnamed writer cursing a woman called Carpime Babia, a garland weaver, and begging the underworld gods for her own fertility. The curse writer calls down Epimenion Katagesid, or monthly destruction for Babia. Some scholars have interpreted this as an attempt to curse the unfortunate garland weaver with painful periods. But sort of the word pain isn't present in that part of the curse. And I argue that the period does not need to be physically painful in order to cause pain. The monthly destruction could simply be that Babia menstruated every month with painful regularity, forcing upon her the same infertility that the curse writer begs the gods to rid her of. The tension between these women is a result of their respective fertility and infertility, which would in turn impact their social identity, and the mechanism through which change is sought by the curse writer is through control over menstruation. And this is what I argue the piglet-bearing figurines speak to, albeit in a ritual rather than a magical context. The female figurines here are shown carrying piglets, but it seems clear to me that these figurines go far beyond representing the flesh and blood sacrifices that took place. The statuettes are not like the terracotta piglets found in Pit A either. They were not treated in the same way as sacrificial piglets. None of them have been found burnt or alongside other pit burials of ash. Instead, I argue that the figurine's very stature itself necessitates a different framework of understanding. While I mentioned before, there have been thousands of miniature figurines found at this site, almost all of them of female subjects. The piglet-bearing figurines are one of the most popular categories, with around 200 exact examples. The figurines are all of a miniature size, ranging from 6 to 50 centimeters tall, although most stand at around 12 to 20 centimeters, which puts them at roughly the size of a modern-day Barbie doll. Because of this, they kind of are perfectly scaled to fit snugly in the hands of the votaries that dedicate them at the site. They're almost exclusively of local manufacture, likely originating in the Potter's Quarter, before being taken up on a journey up the slopes of the Acro-Corinth, although no doubt we probably would have been able to purchase some up there as well. As they were transported, the figurines were likely either cradled in the crook of their arms like a suckling baby, or held carefully in one hand as the worshipper made their ascent to the temple. In this way, the figurines are held in a manner which mirrors the way in which they hold their piglets. As terracottas, they demand a certain tenderness due to their fragile material, and they perform a kind of careful handling of the piglets which they themselves require, and their dedicators' request of their own piglets in the sanctuary context. The question of identity as it relates to the figurines is compounded by the conundrum that lies at the heart of the figurines themselves. Who are these female figures? Are they votaries making dedications of the piglets to the goddesses that they've come to worship? Or are they the goddesses themselves holding the gift they've received in their arms? It may be even that they are both at the same time. Gloria Merker, who compiled the catalogue of terracotta figurines at Corinth, suggests they produce a deliberate blurring between mortal and divine. However, as she sees this as a byproduct of these designs, I instead argue that this effect is intentional. In constantly shifting between the status of goddess and mortal, the dedicant and the dedicated to, the figurines enact a kind of cyclical viewing, which mirrors the cyclical nature of the very process to which they are dedicated. As the purification of the body through menstruation repeats, so does the process of dedication and reception which these figurines permit. Instead of the sacrifice of a live piglet, a one-off event, these pieces are long-lasting, continually reperforming a sacrifice as long as they remain standing. These are deeply personal objects, which speak to an intense relationship between personal identity and religion, which is found at this site. I hope I've managed to show that at the Temple of Demeter in Corinth, these piglet-bearing figurines can take us into a world which is so often inaccessible, and a world in which these self-conscious statuettes draw attention to the periods of bleeding which made up the lives of ancient women, and how they were aware that their fertility was, quite literally, in the hands of the gods. A world in which women themselves are active participants in shaping their gender identity and performed rituals to gain control over their bodies and their future, and a world in which they beg to be handled with the same tenderness and care as these fragile figurines do.
Thank you very much, that was fantastic.